You gonna go first, or do you want me to just?
Okay, so welcome to the live chat with Gabe Klein and Dan Vach. I'm Jason from Island Press, and I'd like to introduce Dan and Gabe to you, and then Dan's going to take over and hopefully ask Gabe some really great questions. Dan is Governing's Transportation and Infrastructure Reporter. He has covered transportation policy for 5 years. Dan also developed a deep knowledge of government generally and of state specifically as a reporter for the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin and for Stateline. He has a master's degree in public affairs reporting from the University of Illinois Springfield and a bachelor's degree in English and German from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He grew up in the Chicago suburbs and now lives in the greatest city in the United States, which is Washington, D.C. And I don't think Gabe would have any argument with that, maybe.
One of the greatest cities. One.
Gabe is the former DOT director under Mayor Rahm Emanuel's administration in Chicago and former director of the Department of Transportation in D.C. under Mayor Fenty. Before working in local government, he worked at a few startups, which one of them is Zipcar. In 2015, in addition to his other roles, Gabe joined Fontanelles Partners as a special venture partner on their new fund, and he continues to advise a number of technology and mobility companies, including Transit Screen and Phone to Action, where he provides leadership on strategy. He's on the board of NACTO and Streets Blog, and in his spare time, he raises a family and wrote a book, Startup City.
Thanks, Jason.
Yep. Dan, take it away.
Sure. Well, before we get going with some of the hard-hitting questions, Gabe, why don't you just give us an idea of what the inspiration for the book is and what you're trying to accomplish through it. It's obviously a lot of personal stories, but I think there's a greater point to it, so why don't you just kind of give us the overview there.
Great. And before I get started, I just want to thank Governing and Island Press for putting this on. So thank you guys. And I'm sitting in Houston, Texas right now. So this is my hotel room. And I'm making a full swing through Texas. And it's great to see the energy in places like Dallas, Houston, and Austin to make the change that we outline in Startup City. The genesis of the book was, after spending about 13, 14 years in the private sector and then 5 years in the public sector, I had this realization that there really should be more sort of commonality between the two. There should be more shared strategies, shared incentives, and shared outcomes between the two. And as somebody who was frustrated with government when I had startups or worked in startups, from Zipcar to my food truck company, and so on, working in the bike business, I found government to be sort of stymieing and very bureaucratic, lots of red tape, and they didn't seem to really understand that I was trying to do good for the city. I wasn't just trying to make money. It was sort of like all businesses were put into the same bucket by a lot of people, particularly mid-level people within government agencies. And when I worked in government, I got a greater understanding of why. And I saw that there were just wonderful people in government, for the most part, that really wanted to make positive change, but they were very skeptical of the motivations from the private sector. And I tried to engage with all stakeholders, private sector companies, aldermen, the public, by having basically like an open door policy with the public and the press, doing chats like this even in the early days of this type of thing in government. And so we really tried to reinvent the way government worked. And my mayors that I worked for, Adrian Fenty and Rahm Emanuel, also believed in getting things done as fast as humanly possible, or as I say in the book, getting shit done. Because at the end of the day, if you're just planning stuff all the time, you're not executing it, then the citizens aren't really benefiting. And so when I left government, I had a few people come to me and say, hey, have you thought about writing a book about this? And I had started to get a lot of invitations to come speak. And people were asking me, how do you get a lot done in government? If you're in the private sector, how do you get the government to accept what you're doing or even engage with you? How do you find funding for some of these projects that are maybe viewed as outside of the mainstream, or were, like bike lanes, for instance? And how do you do outreach? How do you reinvent the way a government agency deals with the public? So when I started talking to Island Press and Knight Foundation about doing the book, and I started speaking, and I was a fellow at the Urban Land Institute, I realized, wow, there's a real demand for this information. So I tried to lay it out in really simple, almost fun terms in the book. It's very colorful. David Vega Barakowitz worked with me on the book. He was the head of the Designing Cities Initiative at NACTO, and is a student now trying to get his doctorate. I shouldn't say trying, getting his doctorate at MIT in urban planning. And he worked a lot on graphics and editing. And I think what we got with the book is a really accessible handbook for change in cities. And it really, I think, goes beyond people in government. I think it's also a handbook for change for private sector people. And what I would like to see is more aligned incentives between public and private and advocates. I believe that projects and initiatives can be a win-win-win. They can be a win for politicians. They can be a win for the private sector, and they can be a win for the citizens. And we shouldn't be leaving citizens behind either. We shouldn't be leaving people behind that are less affluent. We should have the same access to services for everybody. And sometimes it takes delving a little bit deeper and pushing yourself a little harder to come up with a solution that really works. And sometimes you're going to fail. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in the book is creating a startup culture within government where people know you have their back if they try things and make mistakes. And also setting expectations for the public that, hey, we're going to try some stuff. We're not saying everything we do is going to be a success. We're going to spend a very small amount of money. Sometimes we're going to let the private sector come to the table and use their resources to try things. And then we'll see what works. And if we do spend money, we'll have a better sense of what works and use your taxpayer dollars more wisely. So there's really what I would like to think of as a formula, a simple formula for success, a streamlined formula where you have one internal and external strategy, where the same strategy for the private sector, for the most part, serves people in government, where the government is more focused on return on investment than they are now, and where the private sector is more focused on working for the greater good instead of solely for profit, and where we create more entrepreneurs in government, outside of government, and by doing that, by changing the culture on both sides, create more alignment between the two. And so that's the genesis of the book.
Great. You go through some of the things you did in government, and I'm coming from, our readers are mostly in government or around it anyway. You talk about some of the Six Sigma and some of these other concepts that have been around sort of business for a long time, but bringing them into government is sort of was innovative and brought a lot of return out of that. What sort of are the barriers to sort of bringing in these best business practices into government, and how well do they work when the incentives are different and sort of the structures are different in government as opposed to business?
I think it really depends on people's attitudes and acceptance for some of these changes. And what I realized writing the book is that what you're really talking about, or what I was really talking about, whether it's internal strategies within your own government agency, whether it's external strategies dealing with the public or council members or the mayor, it's about change management. And the more we can get people aligned on things like continuous process improvement in the public sector and the private sector, the more we can get people speaking the same language and working towards the same efficiencies for the greater good, I think it gets easier to get things done together. And so when I joined DDOT, I wanted to bring some of this basic management philosophy, and it's not overly complex, to the agency. And we actually trained the entire executive team in Lean Six Sigma, which basically, I won't go into detail, but it's about, again, continuous process improvement, not making people feel badly when there are mistakes in a process, but instead sort of celebrating that we are going to come together and fix this, and to lean out all of the sort of extraneous steps in a process. And sometimes in a private or public sector enterprise, you will have things like filling a pothole can have 25 steps. And in Chicago, I remember sitting down with the foremen who run the asphalt crews and the concrete crews, and having them on a blackboard walk me through all the steps and figuring out how do we go from 24 steps to like 7. And when you do that, you eliminate so many handoffs, and there's so much less opportunity for confusion or things that get lost in translation or things that get dropped. These are the same tools that the private sector has been using since, let's say, the 1980s. Toyota, GE. And by the way, I'm by no means like an expert in Lean Six Sigma, but I know enough about it, and I've used it enough to know that it's been absolutely essential to Zipcar's success, for instance, to being able to manage a complex operation. And when I looked at running a DOT, there's about nothing as complex as public works or transportation. From dealing with the public and in some cases in public works, picking up people's trash, very consumer-focused stuff, or fixing potholes, to building, $500 million bridges or transit systems. It's incredibly complex, and so you need to have a lot of these processes really dialed in, so that instead of chasing your tail around mistakes all the time, you're more focused on being creative, and your team is more focused on being creative. And some people will read the book and be like, well, wait a second, I don't know if I want that much sort of order in my life. I don't know if I want things to be that organized. But what you find, because people think it stymies creativity, what you find is when the day-to-day activities are so sort of driven by process that you don't have to think about it, it literally just frees you up to think about how to improve things and how to create new things instead of always responding to problems.
And you talk about getting shit done, and it's usually in a very limited amount of time. You and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but why is it important to do it so quickly and to get results, in a matter of days, weeks, months, as opposed to, years that we sometimes talk about, especially in transportation?
There's a number of reasons. For one thing, time is money. And when you look at the average time it takes to conceive to all the way to fulfilling a large project, let's say a transit project, it's on average 13 to 14 years, according to DOT. We did mega projects like the 11th Street Bridge, or in DC, or the Bloomingdale Trail in Chicago, or the Riverwalk in 4 years. So that means a big savings for the taxpayer and for the government. It means achieving results in the political time frame that's realistic, and mayors are typically there for 4 years. Although I'm in Houston, I just found out they have 2-year terms here, which means that basically as soon as you get elected, you're running for the next term, which seems like something that they may want to change. So it's return on investment, it's cost savings, it's getting things in the ground in the political time frame that you have, and ultimately it's serving consumers, not yourself. And what I mean by that is that by just focusing on planning, and planning is very important, and not focusing on the execution, we make it sort of too easy to think that we've accomplished something, and then we're going to leave it up to the public. But you got to really present something to the public that's actionable and that is realistic, and that you think you can execute. And when you do that and you say, look, we've got the money lined up, we're going to do this, we're open to tweaks and changes, that's different than going to the public and saying, hey, what do you think of this idea? So you have to come to the public with and all your stakeholders with an intelligent, intelligible project or initiative. Like with Bike Share, in DC, we did it in 13 months with the help of Arlington County. Or in Chicago, we did it in about 1.5 years, and it's one of the largest bike sharing systems actually both of them are some of the largest in the country. We also set them up to be, break-even enterprises. So that made it easier for us to do it too, and I think it made it a better quality service for the constituents.
In some of these, I don't know, when you're moving quickly, it seems that sometimes other entities are not moving as quickly. I think there's an example you have in the book about trying to do bike lanes, and the Illinois Department of Transportation had control some intersections. When do you decide when to push or break rules versus, kind of going? I mean, in government, obviously, you're supposed to follow the procedures. That's kind of a tried and true thing with public servants. So, when's the right time to kind of push the envelope a little bit on what may or may not be sort of legal or at least approved and vetted and that kind of thing?
Right. Well, there are often gray areas, and in that particular story, I outlined how this bike lane that we wanted to put in, we've been working on it for a year. We had been studied by the state on a few things like this, and it was really questionable whether they truly had jurisdiction when we had been in charge of the signals and had been maintaining them on our dime for many, many years. And all of a sudden, they wanted to exert their influence at the 11th hour, and it was clear to me that it was political, and it was aimed at the mayor and myself. And so in some ways it was a tough decision, but in some ways it wasn't. It was like, look, we know that this is going to create a safer environment for the public. We know that they're on very questionable ground, and we know that it's political and not based on anything, where they really feel strongly that this is not a good idea. And so basically we and I had to weigh whether we were on high enough ground. And what would be the ramifications? Because what you never want to do is you never want to put your mayor in a bad situation. You also don't want to put your staff in a bad situation. The only person that should really be set up to lose in this equation is yourself, because you're making that call. And I made the call that I didn't think they were going to actually try to stop us. I thought it was more sort of bluff and bluster. And luckily we were right. And you know what? I also didn't want to be mean about it, because actually the Illinois Department of Transportation, we worked very closely with them, and we worked very well with them. This was purely political, above their pay grade. So we invited them to the kickoff for that bike lane. They probably couldn't come. So these are tough calls. You have to make the same calls in business sometimes. I mean, you look at some of the things going on with Lyft and Uber, where they've really pushed the envelope because they feel strongly that this stuff is inevitable. They feel strongly that government is behind the curve. I can see both sides of this. I think where we've really, what's been unfortunate is that, Uber's pushed really hard and government is not engaged at the level that they should have. And then I think the balance of power shifted in Uber's favor. But I think government's learned a lot, and I think that they are engaging now on autonomous cars and other technologies. And so I hope that the private sector does not have to push as hard as I had to push the state in that situation. But you know what? Sometimes you have to make hard choices, and sometimes you got to do some pushing. And there are eggs that get broken behind the scenes. I always try to present a positive, smiling face, but sometimes we're doing real battle behind the scenes to make things better for people.
Let's go with some of those tough decisions again, because I think those are some of the interesting examples you have in the book. You talked about your mayors having some of that entrepreneurial, at least background or at least disposition.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about this idea of the startup city. You might fail, and I think you mentioned the Pennsylvania Avenue bike lanes as an example. But how much of a leash should they be given? If you're the superior, give your people working for you, or that enough latitude to actually go out and maybe make some mistakes.
Right. Well, if you look at like Silicon Valley, and I'm not trying to hold them up, but they sort of pride themselves on failure. If you haven't failed in a couple startups, you're probably not going to raise money at the rate. And I think that attitude has started to permeate at least startups. I don't know if I would say corporate America. Corporate America has some of the same problems, large corporations as large governments do. But we say we don't want to fail, but the reality is a lot of our foreign policy, for instance, over the last decade has been a failure. We've spent trillions of dollars on creating largely unsuccessful, I think. And so what I'm talking about is controlled experience. experiments. I'm talking about piloting things where you set out the expectation for people. We're going to try this. We're going to try this protected bike lane. We're going to try something on Pennsylvania Avenue. We're going to try this new innovative finance mechanism for this bridge. We don't know if it's going to work, but we're going to try it. And sometimes it's as simple as outlining in chalk on the street what you want to do and letting people try it. Mike Lydon wrote a book, Tactical Urbanism, and there's a lot of examples in there of trying things out. Sometimes the public will take it into their own hands if the government won't do it. And I think that's unfortunate. I think the government should engage with citizens and advocates and engage with the private sector. And what I know from working in the private sector is that they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. So, there was a time when governments were like, should we start car sharing programs? But instead, they partnered with us at Zipcar to allow us to use on-street spaces. I mean, imagine if they had started their own car sharing program. Like, that's not what they do. It probably wouldn't have worked that well. But by partnering with us, we put all the risk, all the money on the line and tried it, and they got all the benefit without any of the risk. And so that's, I think, what we can get to if the government will let the private sector come in, screw up on their own dime in a controlled environment, or try things on their own, like the small bike share system. And we talk about that in the book. People call Smart Bike in DC a failure. I wouldn't call it a failure. It was a controlled experiment with 10 stations and 100 bikes. And that really, even though some people would say it didn't work well, gave us the credibility to launch the 110 station system.
Okay. And what about on the other side? I mean, how do you incentivize the private sector to be these social entrepreneurs that you're talking about? I mean, what has to happen on the public sector side, but also what has to happen in private business? I mean, not all actors are, both going for that multiple bottom line. Right. Some of them are focused on one. How do you encourage sort of the social benefits to go along with the profit?
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a triple bottom line approach. It's been out there for years. People, planet, profit, and you're right. Not everybody's doing that. Some people are just fixated on quarterly profit targets, and they're not going to look at the long term, and they're not going to do things that maybe pay off in 5 years. For instance, renewable energy is a much better investment right now than fracking, but not everybody's going to do that because they don't think they can get the return fast enough, right? So, I'm sitting here in Houston. I was studying up for my NPR interview on the history of transportation, which undoubtedly involves streetcars, and I found out that there were almost 100 miles of streetcars in Houston, which is considered a pretty new city. But in the 20s, that's how people got around. There were 11 companies doing that. So what happened was the government said, look, use streetcar systems. We're going to charge you with paving the streets where your streetcar systems are. So suddenly it went from being a sort of break-even, slightly profitable venture to being very unprofitable if you had to pave the streets. So that was the government giving a disincentive to the private sector to run streetcar service. And so they converted the buses. Then the government bought the right-of-way and built freeways. So they literally traded the streetcars for freeways. Now, in the example I give in the book with Zipcar, the government wanted car sharing to proliferate. They wanted people to get out of single-occupancy vehicles. They wanted there to be a very visual representation of car sharing. So when people visited the city, we were growing like a weed. People would say, okay, we got Metro here, we got Metro bus, there's this new circulator bus, and look, there's Zipcars at every transit stop. Maybe we don't need to bring a car. So they gave us free spaces on the street. So the city's contribution was free parking, which we were paying about $200, $150, $200 a month for off-street. We got free marketing out of it. For us, it was like the tipping point to profitability. But they also required that we put cars in all 8 wards. So we had to put cars where we didn't have any cars in places that were disadvantaged. And my CEO was like, "Oh, Gabe, I don't know if this is going to net out. I don't know if this is going to work." But guess what? Those cars in Southeast DC became some of the busiest cars in the fleet because everybody needs transportation. So it's a great example of government partnering with the private sector, but then shaping the rollout, right? And we learned a valuable lesson and became profitable because we didn't understand what the government understood. And so I think that's a great example of leadership by Dan Tangerlini at the time, who ran DDOT. And I would like to see more of that.
Gotcha. At the end, as you one of the sort of forward-looking pieces of the book, you do talk about transit agencies and how they could be better run, and I think you talked about value capture and that type of deal. Are there specific things that you see? I mean, I'm in DC. Everybody complains about Metro here, but generally speaking, I mean, what is it that transit agencies are missing, or do you think that there are potentials for innovation going forward, so that that you're not stuck in this 19th century model of transportation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real risk right now. Like, I love transit. I don't just love it for the mobility that it gives myself and my fellow citizens, but also for the responsible development that it encourages, the quality of life that you can have around transit. So I think that we're at real risk if large bureaucracies like Metro, like the MBTA in Boston, other organizations like that don't start to focus more on the consumer and providing them what they want. I think that's one of the fundamental problems. I feel like people just don't trust some of these organizations. They feel like they're not getting timely information. It's not real time. I was talking to, again, my friend Dan Tangerlini about this, and he's like, why wouldn't they be able? Why wouldn't you be able to open an app and see where the Metro trains are, just like you can see a Lyft car? You should be able to do that. And so I feel like some of these guys have lost their way. I think we got to refocus on the customer, and sometimes that might mean not operating service anymore, which I know people are going to say, well, what does that mean? I mean, we don't necessarily, as the agency, need to day-to-day run the service. In Europe, most of the service, not all the service, is run by the private sector. Some of those private sector companies are conglomerates with government ownership. But my point is that the agency can more focus on the quality of the service, on assuring that the service levels meet a certain set of requirements, make sure they're integrating car sharing and bike sharing and payment systems, one payment system for everything, instead of spending their time negotiating labor agreements, right, and trying to figure out how to find money and all these other things. Well, money is still an issue, and governance is still an issue. But at the end of the day, I just think we have to rejigger our priorities. But in defense of these organizations, the public needs to be patient with them somewhat. They are working hard. And I think that the stakeholders that are sitting on these boards, like the Metro board, we have 3 jurisdictions, these guys have got to come up with a better governance strategy so that the GM of the agency doesn't feel like he's being pulled in 3 different directions with people that don't agree.
And actually, just to go with that a little bit, I did get a question about governance. I mean, to what extent, especially transit agencies, are kind of a weird creature, right? But I think this probably happens in a lot of local government and even maybe to the state agencies, where there's issues of the governance getting in the way of the startup, right? So everybody's got their piece. Nobody wants to give up whatever they have right now. How is there a way to confront that? Are there good models that you find to encourage good governance that will be patient enough to take some risk and have a little bit of a startup culture?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll tell you, I'm not an expert on governance, but I've found that simplicity is often better. I had the opportunity to work for 2 strong mayors. It was a big advantage. I didn't report to, I mean, you could say that the council members and the aldermen, are like having a board. But for the most part, I had one boss that I reported to day to day. I think, having 12, 15 bosses can be very tough. And so the more we can simplify that and then give the general manager of an agency the arm's length ability to actually make decisions and get things done. Because otherwise, when you have elected, when you have elected officials on a board, that's tough. You have to watch their election cycles. When they're running for election, they may want certain things. It becomes very parochial. And like with Metro, for instance, you're running a regional system. You're not running a system in Ward 3 or whatever. You're running a regional system. And so I think we hamstring these guys and we make it so they can't be as entrepreneurial because they have to question everything they do based on who the chairman of the board is and what ward they're from. And that's just not a healthy relationship. I talked to them about that job in 2010, just sort of for fun, and they asked me, what's the first thing you would do? And I said, well, I would rejigger the whole governance. And that was pretty much the end of the interview. But it's like, but the compact at some point is going to need to be opened, in this case with Metro. And in general, I think we need to simplify it. I think, London, TfL seems to work very well. Obviously, Hong Kong is a great example, MTR, with the ability to develop land and generate revenues from the land to cover the cost of transit. I mean, that's sort of like the obvious solution for a lot of these transit agencies, is to reinvent them as development corporations. And that's basically how we built the streetcar systems in almost every city in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
All right. One of the other big technical innovations that you put a lot of thought into are autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, however, whatever iteration you're looking at. And you mentioned the urgency of government and advocates looking at this now. What sort of things ought they be considering, and what should they be afraid of, and what should they make sure we're incorporating in our vision for the future?
So, I posit in the book that we're basically on the precipice of this exponential change that we're going to see technologically in our cities. And I obviously focus a fair bit on transportation, autonomous vehicles, vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity. But there's, urban farming, there's 3D printing, there's the future of work changing dramatically as automation in general, not just autonomous cars, but automation of people's roles continue as part of this internet age that we live in. And so I'm amazed when I talk to cities how often, and states, how often they say, oh, we're not taking any of that into account right now. Like in our modeling, for instance, well, how do you decide that you want to build more capacity on that highway? Well, we have a plug number of 1% growth every year for cars. I'm like, whoa, really? And, federal DOT, and I have a lot of respect for the folks up there, but they've been wrong for 15 years every year about the increase in driving that we're supposed to see. So I think it's important when you're doing your modeling as a government agency to take into account the history over the last 15 years. And also, if you don't want to build some of the new technologies into your modeling because it's hard, after your model spits out what it's going to spit out, then you need to say, okay, well, what if autonomous cars basically multiplex our highways, like DSL did with copper back in the late 90s? What if in 15 years, excuse me, all cars talk to each other and can operate, 2 inches apart in convoys? What does that do to our need for more roadway? And you very quickly realize that in a lot of places we have about double, triple, quadruple the roadway that we need. What happens in a world of autonomous cars where we might need 85% fewer cars if, as we hope, transportation as a service, models like Lyft, Uber, Zipcar, and autonomous cars merge, and in urban areas, you don't own a car, you just grab a pod anytime you want to go somewhere. So it changes the supply and demand equation dramatically in terms of the right-of-way that we devote to automobiles, the storage space that we devote to automobiles. And I think we get too caught up in our frame of reference, which is typically like, I've been on this earth 44 years, this is what I've seen. And we need to look at history. So when I give my presentations to people, I focus more than people would expect on history. We went through dramatic changes during the last half of the Industrial Revolution in cities with the combustion engine very quickly. We're going to go through the same changes in the information age, the same type of changes. And I think people need to take it into consideration when they're looking at what to build. And last, I'll just say, build as much flexibility as you can into your infrastructure. If you can build your parking garages with the on-ramps and off-ramps situated in such a way that you can convert it later to office space, great. If you can build shared parking in a neighborhood between 20 businesses and an apartment building, great. Let's not continue to spend money on things that we don't need just because we think it's stimulus.
Okay. Well, I want to that anyone else who has questions to file them. Jason, do we have any in the queue right now? If not, I can keep going.
Not right this second.
Okay. One thing, Gabe, that I did want to touch upon a little bit was how you make sure that the changes you make, and you've made quite a few of them quickly, continue. You know, through administrations, through you know, elected officials, but also transportation directors and different managers. I mean, how do you sort of instill that culture so that it lasts beyond any one person?
Right. Well, first of all, I'll say, you know, I've spearheaded a lot of change, but the people that I work with, the people in the agencies, there are always people that wanted to do this work, and, you know, I removed some of the obstacles for them to do it. And I was able to build a vision with their help, with the advocates' help, with the mayor's help, if the mayor didn't have his own vision around transportation, and then get it done fast. And I brought sort of management techniques and strategies. I think to make sure that the change is something that's sustainable for the long term. I mean, time will tell on some of this stuff. But when you build a new Riverwalk, you know, I know it's going to be there in 100 years. And the reason I know is that it's going to be financially sustainable. Same with the bike share program. So I think the business background that I brought, even though it was in startups and not in giant companies, was really helpful in moving fast, but making sure that it's going to work and there's a return on investment. So, for instance, the Riverwalk, we made very conservative estimates in Chicago about how much revenue we would bring in, and there's a revenue share agreement with any of the retail establishments that occupy it. Some of them are knocking it out of the park like 300–400% more than they thought they would. So when you're responsible with your projections, when you are conservative with them, when you use as little money as possible, when you rely on federal aid as much as possible. I mean, with the Capital Bike Share system, you know, we only used initially at $1.2 million, I think, in city money. And I would argue that it's had a huge positive impact on the city in terms of mobility, cool factor. It's almost like replaced the streetcars in some way in terms of the functionality of getting neighborhood to neighborhood. So, you know, there's a lot of answers to that question, but I think also having little successes, then bigger successes, and then really big successes gets the people internally to believe in you more. You know, I think that due to people like Anthony Williams, Adrian Fenty, Dan Tangerlini, Harry Tregoning, you know, then people like me, I think the city is much less risk averse in Washington than it was 15 years ago, because it's got some I use the word chutzpah, but that's not the right term. It's got some confidence. You know, cities lost their confidence in the late 60s, early 70s. They, you know, white people fled, black people felt deserted, and people of color and poor people, we took their transit away. You know, we took the streetcars out, and they became cut-throughs for suburbanites coming into cities. And now it's like cities have their confidence back. And then we started to experiment. And then we've had a lot of successes. And now we don't mind experimenting more. And so I think the culture starts to take hold over time is really probably the most important lesson.
We have a question from a listener, reader, viewer. They want to know how important it is to have the hard cycle infrastructure compared to soft measures. So basically, when you're replacing a bike share, training, speed enforcement, those are all pretty quick. But you know, if you're replacing entire streets or bridges, you know, that are 50 years old, there's I don't know how much, you know, you can talk about with, you know, flexibility and all these sort of concepts you're using. Those get to be a little bit more difficult of a challenge, it seems.
It does. I mean, so there's two things I would say there. I'll get back to flexibility, but one thing is, before I left the agency, I tried to make sure there were shovels in the ground to make sure it was going to happen. So the Riverwalk was a big initiative. We did it in record time, got it from conception to, you know, through design and engineering to construction. The shovels were going in the ground when I was leaving Chicago. The only project that we didn't have shovels in the ground really was the bus rapid transit system, which is now underway in the loop, and then hopefully in the future on Ashland. Structure, you have to get it to a point where hopefully they can't turn back and not do it. And they have the tools, the roadmap, and everything set to go ahead and do the work. In terms of flexibility, you can design streets to be flexible. I mean, it's harder, But actually, Janet Atarian in Chicago, she has a concept called flex streets. And the idea is to create streets that can be neighborhood-oriented streets at certain times of the day, more commerce-oriented sort of market streets at certain times, and industrial streets where people are shipping things, let's say from 4 a.m. to 8 in the morning. So building as much flexibility into our streets with retractable bollards, movable planters, things of that nature. And I do think that modularity and flexibility are hugely important. And some of the protected bike lanes that we've built, you know, the nice thing is you can change them. You know, 15th Street, when we put that in DC, was a one-way bike lane. The feedback we got from the community, which surprised us, because we thought people would want us to take it out, they ended up liking it because it slowed down traffic. And they said, hey, our only complaint is it should be a two-way bike lane. And we're like, wow, that's amazing. So we made it a two-way bike lane. But we had the flexibility because we used plastic posts to do that, if we needed to change the width, for instance. So it can be done.
Great. We have another question from Twitter. They want to hear what surprised you the most about the work you've done, both in your successes and in your failures.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is, you know, let's say you're sort of sitting in the middle on the political spectrum, you know, maybe leaning a little left working for these Democratic mayors, and you'll have people on your left that'll be critical because the thing you did they didn't think was good enough, even though like they wanted a bike lane, but they wanted a perfect bike lane. And then you'll have the people on the right saying, why are you building bike lanes? You know, you're just taking space away from cars. So I think one thing that surprised me a bit was that you would do a project and it would be a raging success to you, but it would be considered a failure by some people on your left and a failure by some people on your right. So these are hard jobs, and you know, I think a lot of people don't want to go into government because you almost feel like you can't win. And what I want to relay to people is, you know, there's always going to be tough times, but as long as you're making the vast majority of people, you know, safer, happier, and you're doing good work that you believe in and you're passionate about, it can be very rewarding. I also was surprised in general that I was pretty good at running an agency. You know, I had $1 billion budget between capital and operating and subsidies to Metro and all this stuff, and you know, it's complex. But actually running startups and being in business really prepares you well. In terms of failures, you know, when we failed, it was often due to my lack of paying attention, lack of proper outreach. Like there's a particular bike lane I'm thinking of in Chicago where there was really a lack of outreach to the community. And communication is such an important part of change management. If you screw that up, whether it's internal communication, like on the Pennsylvania bike lane, there are still people that disagree about, you know, how did that happen, that mistake we made? And not everybody agrees, even within the agency and me. And so that tells me that I did a really bad job of communicating exactly what I wanted to all the stakeholders. So, you know, you learn to learn. You know, it's like once your cup is full as a manager and you think you know everything, you're screwed. You need to be open to your own failure, and you need to also be open with the public when you screw up.
We have another Twitter question here. Can small and mid-size, maybe not so progressive cities, can they still make this kind of change quickly when maybe the groundwork hasn't been as prepared as what you walked into in Chicago, DC?
Absolutely, and I think it could be done more easily and better, to be honest with you. I mean, I think you have less complications. You may have a population that has never seen like a protected bike lane or, you know, a Lyft or an Uber or something, but the thing is, if you clearly communicate what you're doing, why you're doing it, and your mayor or your council members, whatever type of government you're in, if they will get behind you and explain to people, we're going to try something. You know, we're not dictating that everybody's got to do X, Y, or Z. We're not saying we're going to do this forever. We're going to try something. You would be amazed, particularly in small towns. And I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is not a big place. And they have experimented with a lot of stuff, including closing the downtown mall, transit, you know, bike facilities. And it's a small town of 100,000 with the suburbs. So no, small towns can absolutely do it, and suburbs can do it. And I think I'm excited about suburbs, which you might be surprised to hear, but I think the urbanization of suburbs and the blank slate that some of them have, it depends on how they've built, is really exciting. And there's some great examples, actually, of success in suburbs right now.
And one or two that come to mind in particular?
Well, coming from D.C., I think Arlington County, Alexandria, now Fairfax, building transit and no kiss and ride lots. Gaithersburg, a lot of Montgomery County reinventing itself as basically urban villages where people can live, work, and play, and they have everything they need, or not everything, but a lot of what they need within, let's say, 5 minutes walk. I think that's exciting because places like D.C., which I love D.C., but not everybody can afford to live there. We need to make some changes in D.C. to make it more affordable. And if we're not going to make those changes, then people are going to move to Gaithersburg. And if they move to Gaithersburg, let's give them a great quality of life in Gaithersburg so they don't have to drive everywhere.
Sounds good. Another question from Twitter. What do you hope the book is going to accomplish?
That's a great question. So, I travel around and speak a lot. I'm hoping to put myself out of business by putting so much good information in the book that people are like, I don't need to have them come speak because we sort of got it all here in this book. I'm being slightly facetious, but I really wrote the book to be a handbook for change. And so I wanted to make it colorful. I wanted to make it easy to read. I have a little bit of ADD. I'm not ashamed to admit it. And I don't read a lot of books anymore. I read a ton of articles. This is a book I would actually read because it's got 95 pictures and diagrams. It's 6 by 6. It's colorful. It's fun. It tells great stories. I hope people feel that way. And so I hope that people find it to be very practical and also something they can pass on. Buy a copy, pass it through their office, and then put together really pragmatic strategies for how to get things done.
Great. Another question from Twitter. Someone wants to know if you have a vision for public-private partnerships for cities and pedestrians.
I do. When you look at the Riverwalk in Chicago, that's a pedestrian promenade on Wacker Drive, which is not a place that you would typically think of as a place you'd want to hang out as a pedestrian. This was a place that had no contiguous a way to get from one end to the other. They were selling dollar beers, so it was not very high value, and yet it's on the Chicago River downtown. So what we did is, you wouldn't necessarily think of it as a traditional public-private partnership, but the tour boats that generate quite a bit of revenue from selling tickets for architecture tours stepped up. We did an RFP. I'm not saying they were completely willing at the beginning, but they stepped up and they paid a lot more money for those boat slips, which basically funded the year note for the $99 million to fund that Riverwalk. So in my mind, on the continuum, that still falls in there as a public-private partnership. And why? Because ultimately the private sector will pay for that for the use of the citizens. The city will come out ahead financially, and it's because it's because those tour boats, their business is going to boom now as a result of that new Riverwalk. So the tour boats are going to do better and pay more. The city is going to generate more tax revenue, and the people of Chicago now have a beautiful place for the next 100+ years to hang out on the Chicago River. So, I think we need to open our minds in terms of what a public-private partnership is. And I think fundamentally it's about a relationship, and it's about establishing a good relationship between the two. Sometimes you got to play a little hardball on both sides, but at the end of the day, making sure that if you're asking the private sector to do more, that they have an opportunity to hopefully benefit from it. And if the private sector is asking the government to do more, the government maybe should share in those profits so that they can provide better services. For instance, with all these new transportation services hitting the streets, what if there was some taxation that we could put back into transit? That seems reasonable to me.
Sounds good, and thanks to Jacqueline Schneider, who's at AltMob, for that question. We have another one here. Someone wants to know if you ever said no to a private business looking to get into a public-private partnership.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, it's interesting. As the director of the agency, you don't really get involved in saying yes or no. These are big bureaucracies, and what you do is you relay people that work in procurement and that work in various levels that we're going to be open to this. We're going to put out calls for a request for proposal for a pilot. You don't actually get involved in choosing the person, and you don't want to as the director. For our parking meter pilot in Washington, D.C., we let 8 companies, I think it was 8 companies, participate that all had a viable service, either a parking meter or a sensor system or a pay-by-phone system. We let them all try their wares on the street. They ponied up, they spent their money, they put this stuff in, we tried it, we saw what worked best, then we put out a formal procurement, and actually, I think at that point, because we did an RFQ, we could then choose who we wanted. So, but in terms of have we ever said no, yes, there are companies that, maybe the government does not feel like they're ethical. Maybe they're invested in, like in the 80s, companies that were invested in South Africa, or, maybe they don't have an equal opportunity policy that the government requires for employment. So there are bad actors out there, and you don't want to work with them. But I believe that beyond that, you want to give everybody the opportunity to show what they can do. And if they're good actors, if you can align your incentives with them and you can ultimately do good for the citizenry, then that should trump politics.
We have one seemed right out of the headline. Someone wants to know what role do churches play when you're talking about involving the public and even advocacy groups? Is there an opportunity there?
Well, okay, so I think I know what they're referring to. There are churches in D.C. that are upset about a potential bike lane because they feel that it affects their ability to express their religious freedom, which I don't think is true. I have a lot of respect for churches, but just as I would any other entity, just as I would any other person, any other, any company, you have to give respect to all of your stakeholders, and they are neighborhood stakeholders. Having said that, you have to balance sometimes what one particular group wants with what's best for the city. The city's made a decision to move in the direction of sustainable transportation, of a smaller carbon footprint, and of empowering low-income people to have very inexpensive transportation. So I think that churches do play a role. And actually, now that I answered that question, I realize that's probably not their question. I think their question is more, is there an opportunity for church partnerships with government? So, so let me do a part B to that answer. There is a separation of church and state that's important. And I think we need to be careful about letting religious institutions sort of influence, unduly influence government. Having said that, religious institutions have done amazing work and amazing charity work in our history. And so if there are ways that we can work together, not because of their religion, like for instance, if it was a Muslim institution or a Christian institution or a Jewish institution, that should be neither here nor there. But if somebody wants to do good work and wants to partner with the government, absolutely, we should do that. But I do think you want separation of church and state as well.
Cool. And I know, there's lots of religious institutions do human service work, for example, with states and cities. We have another request from Twitter. Hi, Gabe Klein. Could you compare private/corporate bike share funding models with public models, pros and cons for each?
So this is interesting because, like, looking at the history of streetcars, you saw streetcars privately funded, then you saw them sort of quasi-publicly funded, then you saw them shut down in a lot of places. So it's interesting to watch the evolution in the bike share business model, and you have different jurisdictions doing different things. I think it's really exciting. I think there are 100% privately funded models, there are 100% publicly funded models. There's models like Divvy in Chicago that are shared risk models. I don't have a strong feeling that one is better than the other. I mean, I like the shared risk reward, I guess. I should say that, because I like the government having skin in the game, and I like the private sector having skin in the game. And with Capital Bike Share, it was the first large-scale bike share system in the U.S. launched along with Minneapolis, and they launched as a nonprofit. We launched as government funded because nobody had done it before. When we did it in Chicago, the way the team wrote the RFP, there was shared risk, as I outlined earlier. I like that. The company really stepped up. It's now run by Motivate. They really stepped up and marketed the service really well. They used IDEO to do the branding with us. And it was a real partnership, both systems, but it was a real partnership from the jump. And we knew we were in the boat together. So I have to say I'm probably a little biased towards that, but I wouldn't judge any of them until we see how they do. I think like the folks at Motivate they're working on new business models where they're expanding like San Francisco to something like 600 stations from 60, and I think they're going to be using mostly private sector advertising revenue to fund it. And we did it with no advertising revenue in both cities, but then we layered on sponsorship and advertising in Chicago, and they layered on advertising in DC after I left. And if you design it to be pretty break even before that, then you have money to reinvest in your system with the private sector money. But again, there's lots of ways to do it, and it depends on your jurisdiction and what your strengths and weaknesses are there.
All right, sounds good. One last question, and it's going to be from me. You jumped back and forth between private and public sectors. Do you think more, small business people ought to be getting in government and vice versa?
Absolutely. I think cross-pollination of ideas breeds tolerance. I think we need more tolerance in cities of all types. We need tolerance of people of different economic levels, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different religions, and I think we need tolerance between the public and private sector. And I also say that, I was humbled by the opportunity. I often say I was drafted into government, but I was really humbled that, people trusted me to do this work. And I did view it as public service. I still do. It definitely altered the trajectory of my career, but I think it's a huge opportunity for people to give back, and I think it's sort of like having kids. Like I just had a baby recently, or my wife did a year and a half ago, and giving of yourself to somebody else, the rewards are sort of endless. And I think doing public service, I was just amazed by how rewarding it was, and also how wonderful the people were in government and how passionate they were about making change. And I hope that people in the private sector remember that about government folks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Gabe. The book is Startup City. Great read, a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as well. And I'm Dan Bach with Governing. Come see us too. And thanks to Island Press. And this will be archived for later use on YouTube. So thank you very much,
awesome.
Gabe.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Jason.
Bye.
Bye.